Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Kimberly Bolero, and I am the director of the Holocaust Education Resource and Outreach Center, or the HERO Center, which is a joint initiative between Voices of Hope and the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford. Voices of Hope is an organization founded by the descendants of Holocaust survivors with the mission of promoting a culture of courage to stand up against hatred through Holocaust and genocide education and remembrance. We are so pleased to welcome Dr. Aleksandra Pomiecko for tonight's conversation, and we are very excited for you all to learn more about her research. Dr. Aleksandra Pomiecko is currently an adjunct lecturer at the University of Toronto and holds a PhD in history from there. She received a dual bachelor's in history and French languages and literature at the University of Pittsburgh and earned her master's in Central and East European Studies in Krakow, Poland. Dr. Pomiecko, I could not pronounce the university that you received your degree from, and I'm deeply sorry about that. Dr. Pomiecko was awarded the 2019-2020 Pearl Resnick Postdoctoral Fellowship at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for her research project, Transatlantic Connections, Ships, Migrants, and the Second World War in Mexico. Tonight's moderator is Colleen Simon. Colleen teaches humanities at Solomon Schechter Day School in West Hartford and is a Voices of Hope board member, as well as a PhD candidate in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Gratz College. We are so excited to host Dr. Pomiecko, and it is through her work with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum that we came to know her and learn about her research. The HERO Center is a partner with the museum through the Conference for Holocaust Education Centers, and Colleen is a museum teacher fellow. And so we are delighted that we have been able to continue our relationship with the museum in Washington, D.C. and bring unique scholarship to our community. So please join me in welcoming Colleen Simon and Dr. Pomiecko. Colleen?
Thank you. Good evening. I'm very excited about tonight's program, but just a reminder to please remain muted during Dr. Pomiecko's talk. If you have questions, and I hope there will be plenty of great questions, just write them in the chat box. And to do that, you just hover your cursor over the chat and you type in your response or your question. But just make sure when you open the chat box that it says to everyone so that we can all share in your question. Thank you. And once again, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Pomiecko.
Thank you so much for inviting me, for having me here to share some of my research with you. I'm just gonna take this moment now to share my screen so you can see the PowerPoint presentation that I've put together. Here we go. And I hope everyone can see that. I think it should be up now. Perfect. So thank you again for inviting me. It's always a pleasure for me to be able to share my research. And I always find it extremely rewarding to be able to talk to different audiences because everyone has a different perspective, whether it's an academic, professional, or personal connection to some aspect of this story. So I'm really interested in the questions and in the discussion that I know will help me in my research in the future. With that being said, as a researcher, but also as an instructor at the university at different undergrad levels, I am really interested in history and in looking at conflict in global and transnational ways. So if you heard a little bit of the bio that was presented, you know that I have a background in Eastern Europe, that I studied in Poland, and so it should come to no surprise that my background is mostly from an Eastern European historical perspective. So this is how I came to the topic of Mexico. And I was fascinated at the connections that are available in the archive between Mexico, Latin America, North America, and Europe, but also global trends. And I think we see a lot of this happening right now. The museum a few years ago opened a new exhibition called The Americans and the Holocaust, where we really got a sense of how people here experienced the Second World War and the extent of the Holocaust. And so I really see this research as part of a continuing trend in adding extra global layers to our understanding of the Holocaust and of the Second World War. And so when I examine Mexico within Latin America and within sort of the Western Hemisphere, I'm also really interested in precisely looking at these connections. And the way I approach this is by looking at migrants and ships and trade happening between Mexico and primarily Europe. Typically, I think, at least when I remember when I was a student and when I talk to my students, when they think of Latin America and they think of that in the context of the Holocaust or the Second World War, the first thing that comes to the mind is, oh, Nazis running away in the post-war period, Argentina, Latin America, South America. And so what this research, I hope, does is to shed light precisely on the earlier part of the war, on the earlier part of the migrant experience, and of course of Jewish experiences earlier in the 1930s and early 1940s. Geopolitically, Mexico at this point in time undergoes a series of very important changes. In 1938, Mexico, Mexico nationalizes its oil industry. And Mexican oil was, as you can imagine, quite a vital resource, especially in the late 1930s when people and countries and states are sort of gearing up for war and trying to accrue as much of that petroleum as possible. But in 1938, Mexico nationalizes its oil industry. And the main companies that were active on the Gulf Coast of Mexico was Shell, the Anglo-Dutch company, and Standard Oil of New Jersey, a US company. So in nationalizing oil in the spring of 1938, Mexico receives a lot of backlash. There's an embargo against oil exports from Mexico. So this is something to sort of keep in mind where Mexico is strategically in the late 1930s. Relations between Mexico and the United States and what would later be the Allies ends up being pretty sour until about 1941. Just before Pearl Harbor. A lot of people think that Pearl Harbor sort of changed relations between Mexico and the US. It's not quite true, it happened before. But essentially what you see is a warming up of relations. And they warm up, relations between Mexico, the UK, and the United States get better. And by the following year, in 1942, May 22nd to be exact, Mexico officially declares war against the Axis powers. So Mexico is neutral until May 1942. So this critical period from 1938 to 1942 is really important for Mexico. It's really important for the world in terms of oil, energy resources, and procurement of this really important resource for war purposes, especially. But this period is also very important when we talk about migration and refugees to Mexico. And I don't think those two elements are mutually exclusive, the geopolitical aspect and the refugees and the migrants that are trying to travel to Mexico. And one of the best ways to introduce the topic of refugees and migration to Mexico is this slide that I use in my class. So this is a breakdown, and these are all very, very rough estimates. It's very difficult, as you can imagine, to procure accurate figures in terms of the amount of refugees coming in. But roughly, based on the scholarship and the work of other historians, we can estimate that about 100,000 Jewish migrants traveled to Latin America between 1933 until 1945. There are a few patterns that we see in the figures. For example, we see that Argentina, in absolute figures, has the highest amount of number of Jewish migrants it accepted, but actually many migrants came through Bolivia and ended up in Argentina. We see that, for example, Bolivia is a very small country, but proportionately to its size, it actually accepted the most amount of Jewish refugees in any Indo-American country. And on the opposite end, you have Mexico, a country that's extremely large, vast in resources, vast in opportunities, but accepted less than 2,000 Jewish refugees between that period. There are other trends that we can see from these figures. A lot of students have asked me, well, what would cause one state to accept more Jews or refuse? And we see, for example, Dominican Republic, a country that's very small, accepting quite a large number of Jews into its country. But it had a lot to do with an international image that the dictator of the Dominican Republic wanted to portray to the world. So he wanted to accept more Jewish refugees to better the image of the Dominican Republic. In the early 30s and late 1920s especially, there were a lot of border wars in Latin America. And so some of these countries that were willing to accept more Jewish refugees were doing that in order to populate those problematic border areas. Some of these countries wanted to develop the agricultural industry, and they wanted to attract Jewish migrants to work in these agricultural settings that other people just didn't want to work in because the conditions were quite awful. So there are different reasons and motivational factors as to why these numbers vary. My students and researchers and other presentations that I've done are quite surprised with the figure that pertains to Mexico, because they hear stories about Leon Trotsky going to Mexico and this big leftist community coming and being accepted, this vibrant artistic community existing in Mexico. But this acceptance of Trotsky and other intellectuals was really confined to that class and that category of people. It did not translate to people at large or communities on a more broader spectrum. So I think this is a really good way to think about and situate Mexico within Latin America, I think. The other sort of set of figures that's very important, and I think it's really important to keep this in mind, is the fact that this attitude towards Jewish migrants has to be contextualized within broader attitudes against what the state called undesirables. Undesirable people, meaning those who were seen as not being able to assimilate into Mexican culture, into the Mexican nation. And there's a series of laws beginning in the early 1920s all the way until the mid-1930s, some secret and some open bans, limiting the number of people coming in to Mexico. And you see here just a handful of some of these categories of undesirables that the state limited entry to the country. And again, a lot of these depend on different things. For example, the ban on Asian Indians was secret. And it was secret because Mexico did not want to anger the United Kingdom, and India was a mandate of the United Kingdom, did not want to anger the United Kingdom and sour relations by openly banning Asian Indians. Similarly with the ban on blacks, that was a secret ban. Why? Well, because the US had really good, Mexico had really good relations with the US, and they wanted to have this ban be secret in order not to sour relations with the US. With countries, for example, that Mexico didn't have such a good relationship with, or countries that Mexico did not see as being superior, such as China at this time, these bans were open. There was an open limitation to how many Chinese migrants could travel to Mexico. So it really was dependent on these sort of geopolitical perceptions that Mexico had. And other bans were just secret because they were trying to eliminate a certain category of people without saying who the category of people were. So individuals of Arab origin, for example, Jews were in that category. But the ban in 1929 against limiting Poles and Russian was also an effort to eliminate Jews coming into Mexico. Similarly with Hungarians, even though you have a ban in 1926, limiting the amount of Roma or perceived to be Roma people into Mexico, the ban in 1931 was a reasserted effort in order to eliminate what the state thought were Roma, disguising themselves as Hungarians coming into the country. So thinking about Jews and the experiences of Jews within these broader categories is really important. And it's really important to think about it as sort of a systematic series of laws restricting a number of people of different backgrounds. In terms of Jewish migrants specifically, The law becomes more specific and more restrictive and much more articulate. And by 1934, we see Jews being excluded in writing. And the specific line or excerpt from this law I'm going to read right now outlines the reasoning for this exclusion. So I'm quoting now. Due to their psychological and moral characteristics, the type of activities which they carry out, and the procedures used in their commercial businesses, which they invariably undertake, proves undesirable, and in consequence, individuals of the Semitic race may not immigrate into the country, end quote. So this appears for the first time in 1934. What this was all part of was an intention on behalf of the state to really articulate what the Mexican race was. And it described this as being mestizaje. And the state understood this Mexican race as being a mix of the Spanish population that had migrated earlier and was continually migrating into Mexico, a combination of the Spanish population with the indigenous population living in Mexico at the time. And this combination was seen as this mestizaje, this Mexican race. And this understanding of Mexican race translated quite glaringly in figures, because whereas you have less than 2,000 Jews being allowed into Mexico between 1933 and 1945, you have as many as 30,000 Spaniards being allowed into Mexico during the same period. So there's quite a difference in the way that this law actually translated in reality. The implementation of the law was, of course, as in any situation, quite murky and not so clear-cut, because you have something that the Ministry of Interior is putting out in Mexico itself, but then you have the situation of foreign diplomats in Europe dealing with a very dire refugee situation and a desire of Jews to want to get out of Europe during this time. And so what turns out is that because Jews and other deemed to be undesirables are not able to get political asylum or any sort of official asylum documentation, what foreign delegates, Mexican foreign delegates in Europe begin to do is give tourist visas, which was in their prerogative to do. So the majority of Jews that either went to Mexico or attempted to go to Mexico came on tourist visas. And tourist visas lasted about 6 months. So by the time maybe someone received a visa, gathered all their funds in order to buy tickets and everything they needed to do, they most likely had less than 6 months in Mexico if they were allowed to disembark, and had less than 6 months to either renew their visa or find a different destination to which they were trying to go to. In terms of migrant experiences, they vary quite a bit, but I've come up with a few categories to give you a sense of how Jews would have experienced their travel and their stay if they managed to stay in Mexico. There were many individuals who tried to get on a steamship, and in this case, I have a snippet from the collection from the Lori Kunrad papers at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And this family managed to get a tourist visa to Mexico, and they boarded a boat called the Orinoco in Hamburg, in Germany. And this is a boat that moved between Mexico and Germany quite frequently. It started in Germany, then moved to the Netherlands, then to Portugal, then it would go to Havana, Cuba, 2 stops in Mexico, the United States on occasion, and then back to Germany. And so it was quite a frequent passenger ship, and also a ship that carried a lot of other stuff. So in this case, this family had a tourist visa, but they were denied entry first into Cuba, for which they also had a visa to enter. And they were also denied entry in Mexico. And so in their case, they were forced to return to Germany, where very fortunately, they managed to survive the war in hiding. So there are thousands of individuals attempting to go to Mexico being denied entry. And Mexico, of course, is not unique in this situation. The US also refused access to Jewish migrants, Cuba, a number of other countries. But Mexico certainly fits in with this larger shared experience of migration. There were individuals who managed to arrive in Mexico, were allowed to enter Mexico thanks to institutional support. There was an Israelite Central Committee of Mexico that tried to raise funds, and they tried to raise funds in order to convince state officials to grant Jews visas, asserting officials that they had enough funds and enough jobs that they could give Jews a livelihood in Mexico, and so that Jews would not become a burden to Mexican society. So a lot of time, this Central Committee of Mexico, together with the JDC, the Jewish Distribution Committee of New York, raised funds in order to procure tickets on ships, visas, and some sort of means of supporting themselves for Jews in Mexico. But this was not so easy, because the only work permits that these institutions could get for Jews in Mexico were tied to agriculture. And the majority of migrants, of Jewish migrants coming to Mexico, had little experience working in agriculture, but of course working in a different type of terrain. And the only land that these institutions could procure to have agricultural jobs and projects for migrants coming in were often in incredibly dry, hot areas. On the map, I have a region, a state in Mexico, Tabasco, which is one of the most arid, dry regions, where the majority of these agricultural projects were organized. And not surprisingly, a lot of them failed. This was land and work that local Mexicans and native Mexicans did not want to do. And it was very difficult labor, especially for people just unaccustomed to the terrain and type of work that was available. Some of these individuals that managed to go to Mexico, worked in these agricultural products, ended up moving on to different countries, a lot of them to the United States. But some of them did manage to extend their visas in Mexico and sort of stayed there for the remainder of war, and some thereafter longer. The thing that probably gets the least attention, because it is very difficult to study this really, are relations within the Jewish community itself. A lot of times we think about migrants coming in and being excluded from the state or from particular communities that are indigenous to wherever they're traveling to or migrating to, but we know very little about relations between Jews in Mexico. Because there were up to 10,000 Jews living in Mexico prior to 1933. And the majority of these Jews were living in Mexico City, in the capital. Some of them were living in Puebla, in Guadalajara, in Monterrey, which is another big industrial city. And many of them had lived there for many years. So when new Jewish migrants would come, although there was an effort to welcome them into the community, there was an aspect of competition. There was an aspect of procuring a job, competition for funds, for resources. And this many times aggravated members of the Jewish community when you have new people coming in. And then of course, people that have been working to have some sort of livelihood for themselves for many years. So this is probably one of the most understudied topics in this particular issue of migration. I bring up this last sort of mini case of experiences, and it was sort of like an archival gem that I found in a local archive in Tampico, and Tampico's on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, where many of these ships were trying to come in and from which migrants were trying to disembark. And this is a young boy who managed to arrive in Mexico with his family when he was 7 years old in early November 1933. You have his documentation papers. Foreigners living in Mexico had to register every year with local officials, so it was not unusual that this sort of paper existed for him. At the time of this documentation, it's June 1941, and it's just a document verifying that he's still living in the same place that he last registered. So this young man His name was Jakobo Stanikovitz Kleinstein, and he was born in 1926 in Grajewo, Poland. He arrives when he's 7 years old with his family to Tampico, allowed to disembark. And when we see this picture of him right there, he's about 14 or 15 years old. His father in 1950, whose name was Shlomo Stanikovitz, but he changes it to Salvador Stanikovitz, manages to procure citizenship for the family in 1950. And so here we have a little document. And if you look at the left-hand column, it talks about the parents, it talks about that the father, Shlomo, or Salvador, was born in Krajewo, in Poland, in 1894. It talks about who his parents are, and talks about his children, Flora, who was also born in Grajewo, and Jakobo, the boy whose picture I showed previously, also born in Grajewo in 1926. So here we have another snippet of documentation that alludes to a family. So now we know that this family stayed there at least until 1950 in the same town in Tampico. Probably doing very well because they are looking to get citizenship. So at least decided to stay in Mexico at some point or invest some of their life in Mexico. The next time I found and came across Jakobo was in this newspaper clipping from 1962, and it's from a newspaper, La Prensa Israelita, and it's a paper based in Mexico City, and this particular issue comes from July 14th, 1962. And what I saw here was a picture of a young boy, and it's a snippet, it's a piece congratulating him on his bar mitzvah. And in the column on the lower right-hand side, and on both sides, you see the list of relatives that came to visit him in Mexico City to celebrate the bar mitzvah. And what you see at the bottom of the right-hand column is Jakobo Stanikovitz y familia. So Jakobo Stanikovitz and his family. So after some verification, yes, it's the very same Jakobo whose documentation identification papers I saw from 1941. Except by this time, he has a family. He's traveling to Mexico City to see a family member celebrate a very important moment in their life. So there's connections happening between these different cities. At this point in time, if my math serves me well, he's 36 years old, has some children probably, married maybe, who knows. But definitely the family is staying in Mexico. And the last sort of snippet of information that I was able to find was his sister, Flora, whose name appeared sort of in the previous thing when the father is looking for citizenship. He talks about his daughter, Flora, talks about Jakobo. His sister, Flora, marries. She remains in Tampico, in this Gulf city. She marries another Jakobo, Kershenovich, and they have a few children and a son, David, who continues to live in Mexico today. He opened the first clinic for kidneys in Mexico. He's a very renowned nephrologist, and he's quite elderly at this point, but continued to live in Mexico, has a family of his own. So just to see so many different experiences really of people that saw Mexico just as a transit point, people who unfortunately couldn't go to Mexico, and those who, although we don't know the everyday, nitty-gritty experiences, we know that they stayed. And they certainly contributed to Mexican society and were a very big part of development of Mexico in the sciences and the academy and whatnot. So sort of a variety of experiences of those traveling. Overall, I think there are a few patterns. When we think about refugees and migrants, especially Jewish refugees and migrants going to Mexico, there are two big patterns that jump out at me. The first is the importance of connections, the importance of knowing people, whether individuals or institutions that could help those wanting to travel to Mexico go there and stay there. Go there, stay there, and make a life for themselves. So the importance of knowing people who had access to other more important people, who had access to projects, who had access to money and resources was incredibly important. And I see this a lot when I study Jewish migrants from these boats. These are the identification documents of some of these migrants. And in nearly every one of these documentation papers, they indicate that they have some sort of connection to people already in Mexico. And these are the documentation papers of individuals who are allowed to disembark in Mexico. So there is a strong correlation of knowing someone there who's going to help you out, or knowing someone just enough to write their name on a piece of paper. So the state believes that you're not going to be a burden on them. So this was incredibly important. And I've seen this also outside of the context of Mexico. The second important thing has little to do with refugees, of course, but more to do with the larger geopolitical aspect of what's happening in the war and in the world at this time. Whereas in the beginning, in 1938, when you have the first Jewish refugees trying to travel to Mexico, most of which were refused access to Mexico, by 1941, and especially late 1941, going on to 1942, you have boats where nearly everyone is allowed off. And this is one of the examples of the last boat that was traveling to Mexico in September 1941 and traveled first to the United States, this way the opposite, the Serpa Pinto. And of the 184 passengers that got off, 148 were Jews, 128 were Jews, most of which ended up moving to Mexico City. So there is a shift in terms of Mexico souring relations with the Axis powers by 1941, 1942, and allowing more Jewish refugees to disembark and to stay in Mexico. And by this point, 1941, 1942, the term of the 6-month visa was not really paid attention to as closely, and people that were in Mexico that managed to disembark were pretty much allowed to stay there until the end of the war. So I'll just conclude by saying, I think it's an interesting topic, which is why I study, which is why I love sharing my research. But I also think it's really important to move away from, especially in teaching, I know many of you are educators, and I've thought about how to incorporate my research into teaching. It's really important to move away from looking at, for example, race laws or experiences of Jewish migrants in Europe or in Nazi Germany, and really talking about it in the United States, in Mexico, but in other neighboring countries. Many of the students we have will have a closer connection to this. Many of them will probably be shocked, as some of my students have, in thinking about, how things were here in the 1930s or how things were in Mexico in the 1930s. So I find it that besides just it being a very interesting topic, students are quite interested in learning about this, and it allows them to not see what happened as something so distant, but something that's actually very intimately related to where they came from, or where they may do research in eventually or whatnot. So I'm going to end here, but I really look forward to the questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Alex. And we do have questions in the chat, but before I take that question, I was wondering if you could speak more to the relationship during when the oil embargo began between with Mexico and their relationship with Germany, because I think when I heard you speak with the museum, you had talked about this was also the Germans brought in heroin through these trades, and I just wonder if you could speak a little to that.
Sure, yeah. So after Mexico nationalizes its oil and kicks out the British and American companies that were there, the Allied powers, like I mentioned, they had a boycott against Mexican oil. So now Mexico is in a problem because it needs to export oil to obviously make money. And the only buyers were Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan, to a lesser extent, Italy. So what ends up happening is that Mexico exports oil to Germany in exchange for products, in exchange for manufactured goods mainly, in exchange for engineers and scientists who are going to build up companies and industries in Mexico. And so you have these boats that are bringing in migrants from one end, from Europe to Mexico, and you have the same boats also bringing in manufactured goods, but also drugs. And yes, heroin was one of them. And this was obviously not on behalf of the Mexican government asking Germany to send heroin to Mexico. This was an effort of the German espionage community to bring heroin to Mexico and then smuggle it up to the United States. And the belief was that in bringing heroin and drugs to the United States, it would demoralize the public mood. It would sort of become an instigator for the fall, or at least something to deter the US from declaring war against Germany. So this did not work. And of course, it's not the first time we see this in history happening when someone, brings in opium or whatnot to other places. So that was kind of, there's a lot of things happening with the boats that you rightly bring up. That could be a separate presentation. So there's a lot happening. Yes, resources, people, drugs, goods going back and forth between. The biggest irony in this is that, of course, as many of you know, there's the Spanish Civil War happening between 1936 and 1939. So Mexico is actively supporting the Republican Spain against Franco and his supporters. And so the Spanish migrants that are coming into Mexico that Mexico's allowing to enter without any limitations are those opposing Franco. And Mexico's quite open about this. And on the other hand, we know that the Germans are supporting Franco. So it is a very strange relationship where Mexico is selling oil because it needs to sell its oil and it has no other buyers. But on the political sort of diplomatic scale, they're very much against what Franco's doing. They're very much against what Germany's doing. So they're very active in the League of Nations. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic there that's happening for sure.
Great, thank you. And I don't speak Spanish, so I know I'm not going to say the name well, but so we have a question about if you would be kind enough to speak a little bit about Gilberto Vasquez, his actions and relations with his own government.
Could I just remove the screen? Could I undo the screen sharing? Is that okay? Okay, because then I can maybe, oh, there we go. Gilberto Vasquez Saldivar. Sorry, I have a hard time.
You say it so much more beautifully. Thank you.
I have a hard time hearing. That's why I wanted to hear the question. Yes. So this is an interesting case. So for those of you that don't know, Gilberto Vasquez, up to recently, has had a very good reputation because he was very generous. He was stationed in Marseille, in the south of France, and he was very generous in terms of giving out these tourist visas to Jewish migrants to Mexico. And up to about a few years ago, he had this reputation as being sort of this really good individual who made an exception, who was very generous in these tourist visas. But there's been more research recently that suggests that he was not as generous as he may have seemed, in the sense that there was a lot of bribery going on, which is not, I'm not saying this to villainize what he did or to diminish anything he did, but there's been some research now to suggest that he was actually more picky about who he was accepting and who he was giving visas to. And oftentimes the people that received these tourist visas were people with connections or money or some sort of status. So that's sort of the latest on this particular individual. Of course, it does not in any way diminish the tourist visas that he did give. And there are testimonies of people who attest to the fact that he was incredibly helpful during this process of procuring a transit visa. So certainly a very interesting figure. Also, I think he's very interesting because we know more about him than we know about any other Mexican foreign dignitary operating in Europe at the time. After, of course, Mexico and Germany, the relation sours. The delegates and the diplomats obviously not allowed to operate anywhere in Nazi-occupied Europe. And so really you have this Vasquez in Marseille and another individual in Portugal, in Lisbon, who's operating and giving out visas. So I'm not an expert on Vasquez, but this is sort of my 2 cents or what I can offer about him in particular.
Thank you. So, as a follow-up on with the visas, the family that you mentioned from the boat that was turned away, was there a reason? Like, did they have, like, were these tourist visas that were given, were they valid visas? Were people suspecting forgery? Was there a reason why, if they had a visa, a tourist visa, was there a reason they were turned away?
Yes, it's a very good question. So most of the visas that I've seen in the documentation are valid visas from the point of view that these migrants are going to the respective points or where they have to go to get these visas and get them stamped and get them signed. The problem happens at the state level. There's a big point of contention between the Ministry of Interior in Mexico and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Whereas the Ministry of Foreign Affairs wants to give out more visas, and not just tourist visas, but longer term residency visas. The Ministry of Interior is very much against doing that. And what happens is that the Ministry of Interior ultimately wins that battle. And what happens is that you have this tension with people giving out tourist visas in Europe, arriving to Mexico, and the Ministry of Interior, local authorities with the power of the Ministry of Interior say, well, these visas were never approved by the Ministry of Interior. They were given to you maybe in Europe, but those delegates and officials over there are subordinate to the Ministry of Interior. So this visa is null because we did not sanction this. So a lot of the reason why officially, of course, they were not allowed to disembark, even though they may have had visas, was for that. The other reason was, for example, that you could not, and this is the case now when you travel too, that the visa has to be long enough by the time you arrive in a country, right? So you cannot arrive on the last day of your visa to Mexico or anywhere else, and by nature, just because by the time people would get a visa and then get ready and then get on a ship and then stop in all the stops that the ship stopped in, sometimes a month, you would lose a lot of time. So if you arrived in Mexico within 3 months of the expiration date of your visa, you were not allowed to go in the country. So, and in many cases, it just took an incredible amount of time by the time you got money to buy for tickets and sources. And then there were cases when boats were docked off the coast off of New York for months, or for a month and a half or 2 months, and you lose a lot of time. And so by the time you may have gotten to Mexico, you had 2 months left on your visa and you weren't allowed in, just legally not allowed in. Now, of course, there are people that I'm sure forged their visas. There are people that got on because they bribed local officials. I've seen a few cases of that, but those are more difficult to document because there's just no archival footprint of these cases. But I'm sure they do exist quite a bit, yeah.
Thank you. And we have another question from our wonderful audience. They're just wondering, to what degree was the Jewish community in Mexico City aware of concentration camps, the killing of Jews, basically what was happening in Europe, and did their attitude change? And I'm assuming the attitude of the Jewish community change as the war progressed, or it might be I'm not sure, but if you can speak to the Jewish community in Mexico and what they knew or what their reaction was.
Sure, yeah. So in terms of the Jewish community in Mexico, and let's say their knowledge, awareness, I'll just say what's happening in Europe, just to start there. They're very aware of what's happening, because there's a very, very strong pro-Nazi German community in Mexico. And so just by virtue of living with people in Mexico City, they came across people that were very openly supportive of the Nazi regime in Germany. I've never actually seen as much of a strong German propaganda effort in Mexico as I have in any other country, or so far Latin American country, in the sense that the German foreign minister in Mexico was personally responsible for disseminating pro-Nazi propaganda in Mexico. And so there's a really, really direct, intimate effort to really turn the Mexican population in favor of Nazi Germany. There is, of course, not a widespread at all, I think less than even 1,000 members, but there is a far-right pro-Nazi militant group called Las Camisas Doradas, the Golden Shirts. And though quite small in number, they were quite loud, often having a lot of marches, often mimicking a lot of the parades and types of sort of aesthetics of the Nazi regime. And so just by nature, especially living in a city like Mexico City, Jews would have seen this, as would have many, many other migrants. And these Las Camisas Doradas, the Golden Shirts, they were very anti-Chinese, anti-Semitic, anti-everything. So that was very, very visible. I've seen pictures of, swastikas on Catholic churches. And so it was a very, very divisive issue. And the propaganda, of course, didn't help. What research suggests now is that the propaganda effort didn't really succeed in turning most of the Mexican population. But again, that's very difficult to assess just because it's in terms of sources. But in terms of the amount of propaganda put out, they don't see so much support for Nazi Germany, but you also don't see a lot of sympathy for Jews or for Chinese migrants and for other migrants. So that sort of relationship begins quite early in 1933, when you start seeing the rise of Nazi Germany politically already in power, and you see the propaganda efforts by the German Minister of Foreign Affairs in Mexico. So in this sense, the Jewish community in Mexico is very much aware of what's happening in Europe, vis-a-vis all that's happening in Mexico. So that they know. There was also an assassination attempt against a very respected Jewish community leader in Mexico City by this group, the Golden Shirts. So that is also kind of a shock for members of that community. The member of the Israelite Central Committee in Mexico, there is an assassination attempt against him, I believe in 36 or 37, which thankfully failed. So it's it's very tense. In terms of the Holocaust, they know, because it comes out in the press as it does, Karski comes and tells we know that story. So that's publicized quite a bit in Mexico. The only way I've been able to assess how much people knew about the Holocaust or, in Mexico and what's happening is through oral testimonies. Some people not really, having remembered seeing this, maybe they were too young, maybe there's just other things happening in your daily life and, tensions that you don't pay attention to stuff. But I'd say definitely in the oral testimonies I've listened to, by the end of the war, the Jewish community in Mexico knows what's happening. And it's talked about quite a lot. But in terms of, what's happening in Nazi Germany, quite early 1930s, those tensions are there, and everyone's, they're aware of what's happening for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. So, and then going with it, because you spoke before about the difficult, laws in 1934, before they were they said the Poles or the Hungarians, but then in 1934, they basically say they don't want Semitic people. And, but then the refugee comes. So as the war ends, and someone asked this question, did the Mexican government make any significant changes in their immigration policies to accept Jewish refugees and displaced persons after the war had ended?
The short answer is no. Those laws were actually, not all of them at the same time. They sort of trickled out of law, but some of them were actually still in writing until the late 60s, early 70s. Not implemented, at least not officially, But in the post-war period, there's actually a dip in the number of Jewish refugees traveling to Mexico. Really, the prime of the period when Jews came the most to Mexico was in the mid to late 1920s, right before those laws, before that 1934 law. And then that has a lot to do with US policies not allowing Jews going into the United States. So then many of them think, okay, let's go to Mexico. And of course, the Great Depression is given as an excuse for why not to accept refugees. And that sort of adds on. But in terms of the post-war period, which I haven't studied as much, there's actually a dip in the amount of Jews coming in. And there just doesn't seem to be a push for Jews to want to come to Mexico for many reasons. There are also many testimonies I've read of Jews who left Mexico and went to Israel after the Second World War. So there is a sort of another migration of people from, and I imagine Latin America, going to Israel.
And so we have another question about someone asking about why and how a young Jewish woman would have migrated to Mexico before Hitler took power, and how might she track individuals when she does not understand much Spanish? Is there a way to do that?
Is this, I just want to, I'm clear, this is a slide that I showed of the individual, or is this?
I'm not sure if Marcia asked the question, and if you could just add a little bit more information to your question, that would be helpful.
Okay.
I don't know if Marcia's still here.
I can see, I mean, the second question, it seems like a research question to me in terms of tracking individuals. So maybe. Okay.
Oh, she said it's a family member.
Okay. I thought maybe it was in reference because the boy I showed you before. So yeah. There are a few online databases that if you, and I can also send some of these links to Colleen or Kimberly, and then you can maybe share that if that's helpful. But there are online databases where they've been able to digitize, and this is all sponsored and done by the Jewish community in Mexico, where they have managed to digitize those identification cards that I showed in one of the last slides. Those all come from that repository that's available online. So it's a matter of writing out the name, if you know the name, maybe in a few different spellings, depending on what the name is. And then that's how I would start. And again, I can provide the link for that. Going on from there, if you are able to, when all of this pandemic stuff hopefully ends soon, if you're able to travel to the Holocaust Memorial Museum, they have the International Tracing Service, and it's also known as the Arrowson Archive. And it's a great resource for also tracking down individuals, tracking down ships. And there too, it is a bit of a complicated system, but the librarians are excellent and they will help you out. It's also a matter of knowing the name. It's also really helpful if you know the date of birth, the city or country of origin, as much information. And so there are databases that sort of pinpoint different areas to try to collect and trace individuals coming in from whichever country to Mexico. But the best way is to start with this database, and I have it, I think, cited on one of the slides, and just putting in the name. And in many cases, they are able to find other mentions of individuals, and so that's added to the personal sort of case file of the individual, and then you can start doing your research then. It's obviously not exhaustive, but it is a really good start, and it's certainly where I've done some of my research to try to find some more details of individual stories.
Okay, great. And I think Marcia's in Maryland, so she's close to the museum, so if it ever opens up, that would be wonderful. But, you know, again, you talked about the Poles and the Russians and the Hungarians. So the few refugees that did come to Mexico, were they from one country? Were they from different countries, or was it predominantly one area? Or did somebody asked the question before, did any refugees come from Spain after or during the Civil War as well?
Yes, start with the last part. There were many, many refugees who came from Spain who were Jewish who did not declare themselves to be Jewish, especially later on. So there are many Jews that are coming from Spain whose, let's say, Jewish identity was diminished on paper so that they could enter as Spanish Republicans who were persecuted by Franco going into Mexico. The migration of the mid-1920s that came to Mexico, and let's say the ethno-national group from which Jews came from the most into Mexico were Polish and Russian. And that has to do because it's in the aftermath of the pogroms, and so many people are trying to leave Europe, and many of them end up going to Mexico and to many other countries. So that is more, again, just because of what's happening. So even though there is a law later in 28 that limits the number of Poles and Russians coming in, or Jews, the predominant national group of Jews in Mexico is Polish and Russian. And that's, again, the post-pogrom migration of Jews coming into Mexico. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This has been very enlightening and very informative, and we're very grateful for your time. So unless somebody has a last minute question, I think we're good, and I can turn it back to Kim. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen and Dr. Pomiecko. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. I think we mentioned maybe a little earlier, when we think about the Holocaust and World War II history, we don't often think of Mexico. And so thank you so much for shedding light on this with us tonight. Thank you, Colleen, for guiding us through the conversation, and for all that you do for our teachers and our community. So please join us next Tuesday, August 4th at 7 p.m. When we will host author Daphne Geismar, who will discuss her new book, Invisible Years, Opening the Holocaust Drawer. For our educators in the audience, we are also holding 5 free virtual workshops focused on the theme of rescue in times of conflict. This is in conjunction with the Connecticut Holocaust and Genocide Education Advisory Committee, and will be a really special and informative series of workshops for teachers. All of the information you need about our programming can be found on our website at www.ctvoicesofhope.org. When you have a moment, we encourage you to check out the website and our Facebook page to see all that we have to offer. We work every day on our primary mission, which is to support education about the Holocaust and genocide. So finally, if you liked today's program, donations can be made on the Voices of Hope website. Again, that is www.ctvoicesofhope.org. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we will see you next week. Good night.